Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Casey Cardinia Libraries author event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our feature author tonight is Katherine Firkin, who will be talking about her debut novel, Sticks and Stones, a crime novel set in Melbourne, complete with twists and turns as well as disturbing characters under the investigation of newly promoted city detective Emmet Corbin. If you'd like to ask Katherine any questions, all you need to do is post them as a comment while you're watching on our Facebook page, and I'll be able to ask them at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Katherine. Tell us a little bit about your debut novel, Sticks and Stones.
Thank you so much, Moira. So this is my baby, Sticks and Stones. It's been out since early this month, so it's still pretty fresh in the world, and I am pretty excited to have it out in the world. As you can imagine, a little bit of a weird time at the moment, launching a debut in the middle of a pandemic, but still very, very exciting. So it is a crime thriller. It's set in Melbourne, and it follows my lead detective, Emmet Corbin, who's head of the Missing Persons Unit. Now, when we first meet Emmet, he's feeling a little bit almost bored in the role. He's finding that the unit is quite under-resourced and understaffed, and he's really left with these almost sort of banal cases, which he feels like local stations should be investigating themselves. But then he comes across this case of this missing mum, and that's really when things start to change for him. Straight away, he sort of thinks this looks really suspicious because this woman left her two children at a holiday program and they never returned to pick them up. So highly suspicious right from the outset, and we really see Emmet go from one end of the spectrum to the other, from being quite bored and wondering if he's sort of made a bit of a mistake by taking on this job, to the other end of the spectrum where he's suddenly finding himself effectively chasing this really dangerous predator through the streets of Melbourne.
So what was your background before you became an author? What were you doing before that, and how did it lead to you becoming an author?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist by trade. I've been working as a reporter for the past 13 years, which the time has gone pretty quick, and I get a bit of a shock whenever I tell people it's been that long. But most of my work has been sort of involved in covering crimes and breaking news, and a lot of court reporting as well. So I really have relied on a lot of that experience when I wrote this book. Of course, Sticks and Stones, it is fiction, so I can't point to any one particular case, but there are certainly a lot of criminal trials that I've covered and particular crimes in Melbourne that certainly did affect me in a way that made me really, really want to write this book. So I started out at the Herald Sun, and when I started out, I was actually a sports reporter, and all I wanted was to be a sports reporter. It really was my goal. But then I got pulled over by my editor to assist in the underworld gang killings, which were really affecting Melbourne back then. I'm sure everyone knows Underworld and the whole underbelly offshoot that we saw spring from that. And it was a time when Carl Williams had just died, and I was asked to cover his death and also his funeral. And this was something that I must admit I was a little bit reluctant to get involved in because it was so far outside what I had done previously. And I must admit I also felt that the sort of gang killings were a little bit grubby and a bit sort of, just not something that I really wanted to get involved in. But I was instantly just fascinated by this life that was going on. It really became apparent to me very quickly when I started covering these sorts of things that there really truly was this underworld going on right in front of our faces so often. And the people involved quite often, like Carl Williams, really in every other way were very average, very sort of suburban dads. And yet they had this whole other empire going on really behind the scenes. And so that's what really got me into crime reporting and court reporting, and really started to make me think, gee, there is this other world going on, and it's really quite a fascinating world as much as it is, dishonourable.
In the novel, you get an insight into the killer's mind as well as the perspectives of other characters. Was this style of writing important to you, and how do you feel that this sets the tone for your book?
Yeah, it's a good question because it is something that was really important to me. I really did want to do more than what I feel I can do as a reporter. So most of my work up to this current point, although I love it and I'm very proud of what I've done, it is really what I consider to be short form journalism. So, I do the breaking news stories on TV, or I've worked in radio, or I've written for the Herald Sun. But most of those pieces of work that I do, really, I can only ever skim the surface of stories because of the medium I'm in and because of the time I'm usually allocated. A TV news story only goes for about a minute 30 at most. And so what I found was that I was so often almost having to cut out what I feel like is a really important part of the story. And so often I think in the media you do end up with just that sort of evil perpetrator, innocent victim, and you don't really give the general public a lot more than that. So for me to write from the perspective of the killer was important, not to sympathise or to condone any of the behaviour, but just to show that this is also a person, and this person has, gone through things to get to this point. It's a really interesting distinction for me that you can be compassionate and empathetic without being sympathetic and without condoning their behaviour. It's a little bit of a controversial topic sometimes because you don't want to look like you are condoning what they do. But I do think it's a fascinating way to write, to really put yourself in the mind of a killer. How did I get here? Why am I doing this? And so often what I see in the court is that they almost feel like they're the ones in the right. They all feel like, they're not in the wrong. And I find that a fascinating perspective to write from.
And do you find that it's quite often with the killer having that traumatic childhood, that background? Did you find that the case when you were covering those sorts of cases? Was that common?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was shocked when I started really covering a lot of court cases how often offenders have gone through these really quite extraordinary backgrounds and childhoods. And again, right from the start, I do want to say I'm not condoning anything and all that they do, but I do think it's a conversation we don't have enough, is to look back and see how did they get to that point where they became this evil person. One case that really sticks out in my mind was back in 2014, and this was the murder of Renee Lau. Now, Renee Lau is a name that it still bothers me that to this day most people don't know who I'm talking about. Renee was a hospitality worker, a pastry chef. She'd moved over from Hong Kong and she was living in Melbourne. And by all accounts, she was living the life of her dreams. She'd just met this great guy. She was volunteering at an aged care home. She was singing at a local choir. And everyone who spoke about her sort of described this wonderful, vibrant woman. And she was quite literally walking to work one day, quite early in the morning, when a man grabbed her, dragged her off the street, and brutally raped and murdered her. In my mind, again, to this day, I still think this is one of the worst murders Melbourne has ever seen. And I don't think it got the publicity or the notoriety that it really, really did deserve. The attack on her was so graphic. It was so brutal. I mean, I still remember the prosecution report that they showed made people gasp. And they described her head injuries as someone who appeared to have been in a severe car accident. This was so vicious what this man did to her. And yet he had no motive. It was completely random. And what was really unusual was that he had almost no history of prior offending. So if you consider that background, the fact that he was capable of doing something so truly violent really was quite staggering. And when police asked him, why did you do this? All he was able to say was, I just snapped. I exploded into a rage. And for me, sitting there thinking, just sort of seeing this and trying to process this, I started to look back on, well, who is this guy? How on earth can someone get to a point they could do this to someone else? And what I found, again, was someone who had, a really unstable childhood. And again, you're absolutely not condoning it. I know I keep saying it, but I do want to be clear. I could never condone what this person did. It was horrific. But again, when I look back at the childhood, this was someone quite damaged who had a very unsettled childhood, who clearly had traumas that he hadn't been able to deal with. Clearly there was a lot of personal responsibility as well, but there was a huge amount of neglect. And it did make me start to wonder, is there a way that we can interrupt this sort of cycle of neglect? And can we get some of these people back on track before they get to this point?
Yes, certainly, and definitely in the we're not spoiling here. Definitely in the flashbacks, that's very, very apparent right throughout the novel with the that particular character, and I find it interesting how it's not completely obvious, but it's reasonably obvious from the beginning who that person is. The killer is. So did you know when you began the novel how it was going to pan out, how it was going to end?
Yeah, it was very important to me that I had a very clear idea of who the offender was and what their motivation would be. Because my book really is, I feel anyway, it really is sort of all about human motivation and psychology and why we do the things that we do. So for me, I really wanted to have a very clear idea of who this offender was, why they would lash out the way they do, and of course the general circumstances surrounding that crime. Having said that, I didn't have much else planned out. I had sort of a cast of characters and I knew how I wanted them all to be related, but I really didn't know how I was going to get there. So writing this book really did take a huge amount of time. It took me about 5 years of work all up. And I just constantly was rewriting it because I think as I was writing, I was also working out exactly how I wanted all the pieces to work together. And for people who haven't read it, as you mentioned earlier, Moira, it is told in multiple perspectives and there are quite a few different narrative threads running through the book. So it is almost a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle with all these pieces everywhere, and trying to work out how I could get them to fit together in a way that was realistic and believable and achieving my end goal. It did take, I think I did 7 full rewrites before I even got it in front of an agent, and then when I got with a publisher there was still another couple of full rewrites. So this has been a huge amount of work, but I am very happy with the end result.
Yes, definitely. It's a very gripping novel. I'm just at the very end of it. I'm very excited because I thought after I speak to you, I'm going to read the very last part, and it'll be really riveting. So, so the hardest part about writing the book was definitely the different perspectives. Was there any other element that you found difficult when writing the book at all?
There's sort of 2 things. The first was actually for me something that surprised me, and that was, I guess, I didn't realise how much some of these cases I've covered over the years have affected me and have linked with me. It sounds a bit silly, but we do sit there and we do see some really quite horrific, brutal things. And I'm usually very good at being objective and sort of, this is my job, and I put that aside and I go home and I try not to dwell on it. But as I was writing, my first draft was really intense and really quite graphic, and it's nothing at all like what the end result was. And I realised at the end of that first draft that it was almost a bit of a cathartic experience, and it was almost like I was trying to get all these thoughts down on the page. And that whole process was actually a lot more difficult than what I was expecting. And then the other part for me, which surprised me a little bit, was this is largely a police procedural, although I didn't know it when I was writing the book. That's sort of what it would be called. But for me, I guess naively or perhaps a little bit arrogantly, I thought being a reporter, I know how police work and I know what they do and I see them at crime scenes all the time. But once I got going, it quickly became apparent to me that I really did not know enough to make this book as realistic and believable as I wanted it to be. It is set in the current day, and I really did want the police techniques and everything that they do to be quite true to how they would investigate a crime. And so I really did have to take a step back and go and actually research and also get some very direct help from members of Victoria Police. I was very lucky to find a detective who had just retired. He's been involved in truly some of the biggest cases across Melbourne in the past 10 years. Pretty much if you list any of the big cases, he was front and centre. So I was very lucky that he was willing to give me so much time, and we would sort of email back and forwards and discuss various hypothetical situations and how they might play out. And it was always, it was good and bad, because it was a wonderful relationship I established with him, but there'd be some days I'd send him something that I was really proud of and happy with, and he'd write back going, no, that's not at all what they would do. And I was always just like, then I have to go and delete it all and start again. So that part was tough, and it really did add to the amount of time this took me. But again, I think the value in having something that is quite realistic, I do think it's been worth it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's. Have you always been a crime novel lover and reader?
It's funny. When I was a child, I actually was sort of your typical scaredy cat. I was literally scared of the dark, and I was a real chicken. And it was my older sister who was always reading the Agatha Christie's and really, loving crime. And I sort of steered away from that. In fact, in my late teens and early 20s, I attempted 2 other manuscripts, and they were more what you would call, I guess, commercial fiction or women's fiction. And they were both just terrible. So luckily I didn't inflict them on anyone, but I certainly thought that's where I would end up, at least initially. But sort of, again, around my early 20s, late teens, I fell in love with Scandinavian crime, and that sort of carried through the years. I always love reading Scandinavian crime. I don't think I've found anything in that genre that I really don't like. And then I've also discovered things like the Australian crime, your Candace Foxes and things, which I also really enjoy. So I feel now completely at home with it. But if you'd asked me 10 years ago, or when I first, decided I wanted to be a writer, there's no way I would have expected that I would be writing in this genre.
Well, one of the reviews that I read actually mentioned something about how wonderful it is to have a character like Emmet Corbin, who is a detective, a Melbourne detective, and the fact that it's set in Melbourne, obviously, one of the main reasons why I've delved into it so easily, quickly, is because all the landmarks are very recognisable. But can you tell us a little bit about Emmet Corbin as the main character?
Yeah, well, I went a little bit left of field with Emmet, because at the moment there does seem to be a trend to have your main protagonist in crime really almost with someone who's quite damaged, quite a complicated character. Quite often they seem to have a bit of a chip on their shoulder, or they're avenging some sort of trauma from the past, or they've got some deep secret, and that's sort of a real central point of the book. Whereas with Emmet Corbin, I've gone much more to what I see day to day out on the road as a reporter, which is a fairly straight, dedicated detective who's also got issues at home and is living a normal life like the rest of us. But on a day-to-day basis, he is generally a good guy. He's, generally trying to do his best and follow the rules and do the right thing. And he's dealing with all these really complicated situations and really flawed people, and almost trying to make sense of it from a bit of a almost naive perspective. So I have gone for someone a little bit different, and so far the feedback's been that he's really likable and people want to see more of him. So that's happy. That makes me really happy, because I was initially a little bit unsure if I should just stick with what is popular at the moment.
Yes, yeah, definitely. He's a very likable character for sure. Has it been difficult? You mentioned it's been a bit crazy because of the situation at the moment, launching your debut novel. Have you found that part of things a bit difficult, or not really a problem?
It's hard to know, because I really didn't know what to expect either way. I think the biggest thing, initially was I was pretty upset to be, after 5 years of work, I was thinking, oh, typical Katherine, now you're launching in the middle of a pandemic. And I was really sad to miss out on having a proper launch. because, it does feel like that's a rite of passage, that as an author now I haven't had. But at the same time, I've had a really different experience, and doing things like this probably has extended my reach in some ways without having to literally get out of my track pants, which has been great. And, I have still felt like I've been able to interact and get to people in their homes. It's just been a little bit different to what I was expecting. But one thing that's made me so happy is at the moment, people do genuinely seem to be wanting to support Australian-made products. And I hope that translates into Australian authors, because I know quite often it's easy to grab the latest big international bestseller. But, I've been so heartened so far to see that people are willing to, listen to things like this. I mean, I'm a nobody and people are still tuning in and supporting me. And that's been really, really humbling, and really, it's made me hopeful that, the future is bright even post-COVID.
Well, I'm happy to say that I'm sure that people would not want to miss out on reading your debut novel. I'm just wondering if we've got if anybody has any questions at this point. Feel free to post them in the comments, and we can ask Katherine a few questions. One of the things, while we're waiting, one of the things I was going to ask is, will this continue? Will this journey continue beyond Sticks and Stones?
Yeah, for me personally, I always wanted to be an author. So I'm really hopeful that I can build from here and continue and always make writing a part of my life. I'll probably always be a reporter as well, because I love it too. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to keep this balance up. And at the same time, I always wrote Sticks and Stones with the intention that it was going to be a series. So I have been really heartened to see some comments from people sort of asking, is there more? Can we see Emmet again? That made me very happy. In fact, I have pretty much almost finished what I think will be the second book in this series. I'm playing around with it still. It is still Emmet Corbin. He's in a slightly different role. The main crime occurs in Blackgowrie, which is a coastal town. I'm sure most people will know it. And I think I can tell you a little bit. I don't know how many rules I'm breaking, but here we go. So there's three teenage girls. They go out one night for a bit of mischief, and only two of them return. And it's really quite baffling for police, because the two survivors who come back are almost unable to say what happened. They're sort of, oh, I don't know, she just disappeared. Maybe someone was following us. We don't know. So it's all really quite confusing for police, and it ends up effectively becoming Australia's most notorious crime. And the leads go cold. It becomes a cold case. 20 years later, bones are found on the beach. And this is when Emmet jumps in and hopefully will save the day.
That sounds like something to look forward to. I'll definitely be reading that. We have a question from Wolfgang. Were you ever tempted to use a reporter as a character in your book?
This is a good question. I've had this a couple of times. The honest answer is yes. In fact, when I was starting out, it sort of made sense to me. I've seen a lot of books use reporters in the heart of crime novels really well. And I thought, well, it's the character I know, and, it's something I felt I could do realistically. But then when I thought about it further, I sort of realised, truthfully, and I'm not bagging us journos, but I can talk for myself, I don't have the skills or the desire or any aptitudes whatsoever to be running around solving crimes in my spare time. I haven't met a reporter I would trust solving crimes in their spare time. And I guess I just started to feel so uncomfortable about this, sort of like, who would this person actually be? They felt so fantastical to me that they almost felt a bit silly. So I ended up going, no, I want to do this really believably and sort of have my first series based around this detective. And it felt right to me. That's not to say in the future I won't maybe try to take something like that on. It certainly just didn't seem like something I wanted to jump in initially.
Yes, I know there was a media conference in one point, but it was sort of, you didn't get to to see that part. You didn't get to read about the part, that particular. But I've got another question from Janine. So you were in New York when the pandemic hit. How did you feel at the time when you were over there?
Yeah, it was a really tricky situation because I knew I was always going to get back to Australia in June for the book coming out. But then I saw the borders closing and everything happening, and I thought, oh, if I don't go now, I may not actually get back. So I ended up literally in one day. It was like a light switch went off in New York. It was extraordinary. We went from sort of everyone just washing their hands a lot to sort of people being scared to leave their apartments, and it was a real overnight switch. And I just think at the moment we're so lucky in Australia that we have still got some semblance of control over this thing, because when it gets out of control, it's terrifying. It really was scary. And I made a decision. I'd been quarantining and not leaving my tiny shoebox apartment in New York for about almost 6 weeks at that point. And I was, apart from the fact I was going stir crazy, I thought, you know what, I've got to get out or I'm not going to get home. So I booked the flight pretty much on the spot and went straight to the airport. And there was just Australians there trying to leave. There was pretty much no one else at the airport. It was such a surreal feeling. And it was really quite, I think I counted 5 people on the plane from New York to Dubai, and then another maybe 8 on the next leg. It was the weirdest experience. It was really like an apocalypse. And then I got back here, and apart from the 2 weeks quarantine, it was sort of, life is almost normal over this side of the world. It made me realise how lucky we are. But I am planning on going back. I just don't know when. We're still sort of watching things at the moment.
Yes, that would have been really frightening. I think, do we have any more questions at all? We do. Okay. So just mentioning that the novel is available now on RB Digital. If you have a membership, you can access it through that as an audiobook. And the other thing that I'll mention is if you go to Robinson's bookstores in Fountain Gate and mention that you've seen the Facebook Live talk with Katherine Firkin, then you will get a 10% discount. And I believe, Katherine, you signed some copies today when you went.
Yes, I popped in today. It is such a beautiful bookstore, and I mean that sincerely. I hung out there far too long than what I should have. But yeah, I signed quite a few. So if you pop into Robinson's, I think from memory it was on level 2. I'm not sure. It was a bit confusing. But once I got there, yes, it is good. Once I got there, yeah, it was gorgeous. So please pop in because they're wonderful people, and they're very supportive of Australian authors too.
Yes, it's definitely a gorgeous bookstore. It's something that I think everybody, if they had a room like that in their house, they'd probably love it as book lovers. You've reported on some horrific crimes, such as the one you mentioned earlier, Renee Lau's murder. You also reported on the Bourke Street terror attack. When did you arrive on the scene, and how did you get the information to report when the events are so fresh?
Yeah, the Bourke Street terror attack was the most recent terror attack in Melbourne, and that was a real one of those moments where you do feel quite humbled at the job that you do, because people are hanging off every word and everything you say matters, and getting that information really quickly matters, but also making sure that it's correct. And I was probably the first reporter on the scene. I got there very, very early. I was actually driving back from a completely different story, and I heard that something was going on. So I was by myself in my car, and I just literally parked, I think, on a roundabout and ran down Bourke Street to see what was happening. Unfortunately, I did get there so early that the poor victim had not been covered in things, so that was quite traumatic. And of course, there were people standing by. But the good part of getting there early was that I was able to talk to people who had seen things firsthand and really get a sense of what was happening. And I was also able to have a good chat with police before the whole scene was really shut down, because they were very quick at clearing that entire city area and getting the bomb squad in and checking and all the things that they have to do. And once that sort of happens as a reporter, you do get a little bit locked in place and you can't move around. So I was lucky in the sense to get there early, although it was a little bit distressing, but I did get a really good sense of what truly had happened. And from there, I mean, I was doing live crosses all through Australia and into New York as well, all through the night. I was on a 6 a.m. shift that day, and I remember, I think I left at about 1 a.m. that night. And I remember sort of walking back through the city, seeing it just absolutely deserted and feeling really quite, I don't know if I can describe the feeling. You know, I think sometimes people think reporters are robots or something, and we almost enjoy the drama. There's an element of enjoying, you know, the adrenaline and wanting to get things right, but no one wants to see your city in that sort of state. And I remember just walking home feeling really quite empty. You know, it was sort of like, it was a massive day, but it was also so traumatic and so intense. Yeah, I can't describe it. There was just this stillness at the end of the day. And I really was. I took a couple of days after that at home, just sort of like, wow, that was huge.
Yeah, Wolfgang's got a couple more questions. One of them is about switching from the discipline of journalism to that of an author. Are any of the skills of one applicable to the other?
I like that he called journalism a discipline. I must admit, I feel like journalism really is a trade. Everything that you learn is on the job, and it's all about being able to talk to people and get their trust and relate with people. I think that the biggest benefit of being a reporter when you look at what I do in a crime novel is that I really consider almost like I get a front row seat to life. Every day is different. You know, I literally go to different places, but then I'm also meeting all these different people. And I do get to meet people really from all walks of life. And I tend to meet people in their most sort of raw moments, either when something terrible has happened or when something really good has happened. And that's not something I take for granted, because you do develop this really sort of raw relationship. I mean, I sat across from a mum whose son, Luke Power, had just been hit by a car. And her hit and killed, I should say, her grace under pressure was something so extraordinary. I mean, I still remember sitting across from her, and she wanted to tell this story of her son. And he had quite literally hours earlier been taken off life support. And, you know, you don't take that for granted. I still am in communication with her. You know, you really truly do form these incredible relationships. And for me, I do feel like when I'm writing a book like I have, with different characters from different perspectives, you are able to maybe put yourself in people's shoes a little more than maybe if I hadn't been a reporter, because I have had all these really different experiences. Having said that, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately I do feel in media that I'm often only skimming the surface. And so to sit down and write 100,000 words, and I want it to be interesting, and I want people to, you know, be invested in the story, that was really challenging. And I learned pretty quickly that I've developed some bad habits in journalism to quickly get to the angle without really fleshing a lot of the story out. So it was a real learning experience, and it was probably a little bit humbling for me to realise that it's one thing to be a reporter, it is another to be able to write creatively. So I did have to go back to the drawing board a fair bit and, you know, sort of almost start as a complete beginner.
I've got an interesting question here from Wolfgang. Are you ever tempted to take revenge on people in your past and make them awful characters in your novel?
Look,
I like that question.
I would be lying if I didn't admit there's a sort of at least a hint of previous ex-boyfriends in there. A few sort of grubby characters who are not very likable, and hopefully there's a few ex-boyfriends of mine who might be thinking, ooh.
Getting a bit worried.
No, but no one else anyone. But of course, you know, you do take your life experiences and put them on the page, but also from a personal perspective, I mean, I also feel like all my flaws are on display too, because a lot of the time the mistakes the characters are making and their sort of personal flaws are issues that I've sort of either still are dealing with or feel like I've had to deal with in the past. So it is quite confronting and quite exposing to sort of put it all out there on paper and be like, yes, I've had these thoughts too, and I'm obviously twisted and messed up as well. You know, it's quite an exposing but good experience.
There's Chenza has said, love the book. She said she had a strange feeling when she finished. She felt tense, a bit like when she watches an episode of Criminal Minds. Have any of the cases you reported on affected you in life?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really happy to hear that she loved the book. That's wonderful feedback. I'm really interested that she said she feels tense at the end. I can't say too much about the ending,
No.
giving it away, but I am fascinated. One of the things I would love to know from people is how they felt about the offender at the end of the book, because I have told the story a bit differently and given you a bit of insight into this person's life, more than perhaps we would normally see. I am really fascinated to know how that resonates with readers. But absolutely, I discovered, as I was mentioning earlier, I really have been more affected than I probably would like to admit by some of these crimes. And I think the big thing for me, and this is a little bit depressing, but it's truly how I feel, is that particularly in court, I often walk out feeling there are no winners here. It doesn't matter what sentence someone gets, if they're found guilty or not guilty, or if they get a life sentence or if they get a slap on the wrist. I often walk out feeling quite deflated because the victim and the victim's family never truly gets justice. No one can ever, I mean, if we're talking about murder, no one can ever bring a life back. No one can ever heal the pain that that family is going to go through probably for the rest of their life. And on the other side, I never feel like the offender really gets justice either. I mean, like I said, quite often they've come from really disadvantaged or vulnerable or traumatized backgrounds, or even if they've just made really stupid decisions, they very rarely get what they deserve. And I mean that truly. Like, it's one thing to lock someone up, but really to educate people and make them understand what they've done and get them to a point where they actually have some remorse is very, very rare. And so you do walk out sort of like, okay, they're in jail for life, but I always feel like it doesn't really achieve anything. So I wonder if that tension that you're describing is almost, you know, like I've put a bit of that in there or something. I'm not sure, but certainly I do feel very affected by what I do.
Yes, it'd be hard not to. I think somebody would like to ask a few questions about finding your experiences finding a publisher. Did you use an agent? Yeah, so that's the next question. If you wanted to shed a bit of light on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm sure there are a few people here who are probably have their own writing projects going. The first thing I would say is if you are trying to get a book published or you're starting out, don't feel bad if you're finding the process daunting. I found it completely overwhelming. You know, media is one thing, but publishing is a completely different industry. And I found it really quite, it lacks transparency in many ways, you know, and you can feel like you're just up against nothing but brick walls. So if you're feeling that, firstly, I felt it too, and I think most people involved in this will. I made a very conscious decision to get direct feedback on my manuscript. I didn't want to just send it out to what they call slush piles, where you just send it to every publisher and see what happens. I just didn't feel comfortable that either my manuscript would be good enough initially to get that attention or that the right person was going to look at it. One thing that journalism has taught me, if nothing else, is that you need to get in front of the right person to get the answers that you want, and it was going to be the same with a book. So I actually enrolled in a program where I could sit down with an agent for 15 minutes and get feedback on my manuscript. And I did that through the Faber Writing Academy. And I was lucky that the agent I saw, Jacinta Demaze, pretty much signed me up on the spot. I don't know if that happens very often, but she just loved the first 3 chapters and asked for me to send the rest. And so that part of the process I thought was really easy. And I was a bit foolishly like, oh, well, that was good. That wasn't as hard as everyone says. But then the actual submission to publishers was a real roller coaster. And it was a real wake-up call, if I'm honest, to me as well, that, you know, what I had was a decent manuscript, but it was still far from good enough. And so I got this real range of feedback. Some publishers were sort of saying to me, look, we really like it, but it's not dark enough. You need to go away and make it more twisted. And other people were saying, we really like it, but it's too dark. Can you go and make it lighter? And it was so confusing, and everyone was different. Some people, oh, it's written so beautifully. Other people were sort of, we don't really like the voice you've taken on this. And it was polar opposite. Almost every aspect of the book, every bit of feedback I got was almost polar opposite. And it was quite daunting. And I realise now probably the reason I got such inconsistent feedback from publishers was that it really wasn't quite ready. And I'm so lucky that I found my publisher at Penguin, Beverly. She actually phoned me and she said, you know, she was so enthusiastic about it, but she gave me a bit of tough love and said, look, you're going to need to rewrite the entire thing at least once, probably twice, and then probably again. Are you prepared to do that? And I loved it straight away because I love a bit of project, and I knew that she could sort of had the same vision that I had, and she was truly going to push me to make this better. And we did a full rewrite, top to bottom. I had to redo it, and then I did another full rewrite, and then we still did another round of edits. So from when I signed with Penguin, it's been 18 months before it's been ready to come out. So the journey has been long. It's been long.
I think there's probably a lot of people out there, maybe some budding writers themselves, who really, like, I didn't realise there was so much rewriting in the process. I've friends who are authors, and they were asked to take certain characters out, and being your project and your baby, that's probably a very difficult thing to do. Were you ever asked to do that, to take any character out? Or
yeah, I mean, I must say, Beverly's great. She never sort of said to me, you must put this in or you must take this out. But she would just sort of say, this isn't working for me. This isn't, you know, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't flow. And really by process of elimination, I worked out, okay, it doesn't work because that whole storyline is really redundant. And it's a hard decision to make as a writer. But I think I had 2 other whole storylines in the book that I have literally just deleted and had to just shelve because they really were just getting in the way and not adding a huge amount. One thing I will say I'm good at, though, is I think, again, one of the benefits of being a journalist, I am used to people telling me what they think, either the general public or my editors, and they can be quite blunt in a newsroom. It's not usually very delicately handed to you. So I am reasonably okay with people saying to me that is not good enough and me going away, and okay, I can get a bit, you know, annoyed initially, and then okay, no, they're right. It isn't good enough, and then I can work my way through it. But you're right. Even I had no idea when I started this process how many times I would rewrite this book. I think I know it word for word, the whole 400 pages at this point. I have rewritten it so many times, and, you know, every time it's got better. So it's been worth it, but it is a massive project.
Definitely. I've got another question. Did you get a choice of narrator for your audiobook?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I did. And I didn't know. I knew nothing about audiobooks or that whole process, but I did get a choice of narrator. I'm wondering if the person asking that has listened, because I'd love to know what they think if they want to tell me. I had Penguin sort of had it up to their top 3 choices. And they said to me, what do you think? But if you're not happy with any of them, we can recast. I must admit, I made my poor person work for it because I wasn't convinced initially. So they had to go and do another audition. But no, I'm really happy with it in the end. It's a very Aussie, very sort of detective voice that we've got going through it. And I think it works quite well.
Where do you narrate it yourself?
You know, I was slightly offended they didn't want me to narrate it, but, you know, I have got a bit of a squeaky voice. It would probably be annoying after a few hours in the car listening to me.
Okay, I'll just have a look and see if we've got any more questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention about the book, or any particular aspect of your writing? Do you have a special place that you like to write that helps inspire you when you're actually writing?
No, I'm not too fussy in terms of location, and I must admit, as much as I love writing and I love, the feeling of being really involved in my work, I do see it as a job and I do see it as work. And so for me, at some point you just have to sit down and get the words on the page. And so it doesn't really matter if that's in a library or a cafe or, just on a cart and crate. I mean, I must admit, I don't do well in public settings. I like to be very quiet and completely immersed in what I'm doing. It's not always possible, but I do try. I work better in the mornings, and I tend to try to get as much done in the early hours of the day as I can. But as far as the actual book goes, the only other thing I would really say is that as much as the inspiration behind my book is a bit grim and I have dealt with some pretty heavy topics, I think the final product is actually quite, I know light sounds like a funny word, but I certainly haven't tried to make it, a heavy book. I wanted it to be entertaining, and I want people to think, but I want them to, also enjoy the experience. So I'm hoping that people won't, think I've done a deep dive into the state of crime or something. It is still fiction, and it is still fun, hopefully, at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of suspense in your novel. And as I said, I'm just at the end, so I really can't wait to finish it off this evening. And there was one more question. Are there any criminals, living or dead, who you'd like to interview to learn more about them and their childhood and reason behind their crimes?
It's interesting. I must say, every time I sit in court, I feel like I get even more of an insight into, the criminal mind. And it's not even the most notorious ones that I necessarily find quite interesting. I mean, the other day, a few weeks ago, I mentioned this in another talk, but I was sitting in court and there were two guys who had stolen a Porsche and used the Porsche to ram police cars. And it wasn't a particularly horrendous crime. It's obviously serious, but no one, luckily, was really hurt. And when they were sentencing these guys, one of the men, the judge read out what had happened to him, and it was so disturbing. Even the judge was really quite moved by what this person had been through. And I remember off the top of my head, this guy, when he was 6, his dad had beaten him to a pulp because he didn't like the way he brushed his hair. When he was 8, his dad left him to sleep the night in a cemetery, and he said to him, "I wish you were dead. I'd rather you were dead. Why don't you get some practice?" I mean, can you imagine being 8 years old and sleeping a night alone in a cemetery? And then when he was 12, this boy had finally started to make friends and was apparently settling into life, and he joined a local football club. And then his dad turned up to watch him play, and he was apparently so ashamed by this boy's supposed lack of skills that he started injecting him with amphetamines before every game. And, I was sitting in court listening to this, and then I look over at this guy, and yes, what he's done is terrible. He's stolen a Porsche, he's endangered people's life, he endangered the police arresting him. But at the same time, I feel almost quite guilty that my news report at the end of the day doesn't tell you all of that. It just tells you that this rotten guy has, endangered people's lives, and now he's jailed for 7 years or whatever he got. And so, to answer that question, yes, I mean, I always want to learn more because I find it a really interesting topic. And I do think if I want to continue writing crime, it's important for me to constantly be, almost understanding better and better how these people have got to this point without crossing the line into condoning the behaviour, because I don't. But just to really understand what they've been through, I think it's a fascinating thing.
And it's also lends itself to, how people can learn from that and how it can be prevented as well, hopefully.
That's exactly right. I mean, in the real world, of course, the ideal would be that we could identify these really vulnerable people, these at-risk people, and actually get them back on the right track. I mean, in my book, so often you see with my little boy, there are moments he almost is back on track and he could be saved. And I do feel that quite often, if there was that adult in their life that they could rely on, You know, I mean, there are plenty of people who have had very traumatic childhoods who don't go on to offend. So there's got to be an element of personal choice, but there also has to be an element of support that these people are not necessarily getting. And so, I just find that a really interesting topic, and I think I'll definitely continue to keep looking into it.
Yeah, definitely shines a light on that. If you were trapped on a desert island, Katherine, I'm sure you've probably answered this question before, you could only take one book. Which book would that be?
Oh, only one book.
It's hard, isn't it?
Look, I think probably The Phantom Tollbooth. It was a book my dad read to me when I was little, and it's a book I must admit I still think about to this day. There are some fabulous quotes in there which you sort of really can live your life by if you want to. And I just find it such a, I don't know, I think it would definitely be a children's book, as funny as that sounds, because if I'm going to be trapped on an island, Phantom Tollbooth would take me to another world and give me life advice and probably keep me sane. So, yeah, I think that would be my choice.
Good choice. Well, I think unless we have any more questions, really lovely talking to you this evening, Katherine. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, I'll just remind everybody, if you go down to Robinson's bookstore in Fountain Gate, you will be able to get a copy of Katherine Firkin's Sticks and Stones with 10% discount and possibly get one that's been signed by Katherine. So thank you again, Katherine, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone tuning in. The support really, truly has been amazing, given I am a newbie nobody. So thank you so much. It's wonderful.
You're welcome. Thanks again.